Greetings, baseball fans, and welcome to Cigarettes and Bubblegum, an ongoing series of baseball retrospectives taking aim at popular narratives with a critical eye. The first of these was unfortunately rushed out last year after Manfred's blunder in reinstating Pete Rose, Joe Jackson, and a dozen other guys that nobody asked him to. I hadn't planned to do any of these until after the All-Time League was finished, but current events forced me to move that up. And in more recent news, I would like to extend my congratulations again to Carlos Beltran, Andrew Jones, and Jeff Kent on their election last week at the time of this recording to baseball's Hall of Fame. Of course, in the immediate aftermath, the internet absolutely lost its mind, with cries of the Hall of Fame being a joke and being watered down with this recent trend of putting in marginal talent. Hall of Very Good was also a common refrain. Now, for my part, I gotta say, Cooperstown is my mecca, and the Hall of Fame Museum, hallowed ground. So when someone says the Hall of Fame is a joke, I say blasphemy, and usually add that if it wasn't a joke when they put Tommy McCarthy in 1946, then it isn't a joke today because of Harold Baines. But hey, I'm a data-driven guy. I like facts over feelings. And I do wonder if there was some way we could test this hypothesis that the Hall of Fame is being watered down recently. Okay, so for this exercise, yes, I'm going to use career WAR. I fully realize that many may balk at a WAR-based analysis, but if intellectual curiosity is an attribute you possess, stick around anyway. I think WAR is a good stat to use here. It boils a player's entire career down to a single number, which I can then plot. Some things about WAR that make it particularly useful here. It's hard to compile. You don't run up a large number by playing at merely a decent level for a long time. Likewise, it does take time to compile, so short peaks generally won't run up a high number regardless of how great they were. You need both stellar play over a long period of time. So here's the data I'm going to use. For now, let's make that a little bigger. Okay, a couple of points about the methodology. First of all, to account for players like Babe Ruth, Monty Ward, and eventually Shohei Ohtani, I've added both position player WAR and pitcher WAR together if a player had both and they were both positive. This way, pitchers aren't penalized for being bad hitters, and position players press-ganged into emergency pitching duties don't get penalized for not being pitchers. But players who excelled at both do get full credit. Second, there are two major sources of WAR data, baseballreference.com and fangraphs.com. Each has their own method of calculation, and as has been my practice with the all-time teams, I use an average of both. And finally, I'm leaving off the Negro League players, not out of any judgment for their overall ability or the value of their contributions to the game, but for the sake of honest math. Specifically, their seasons were roughly half the length of an MLB season, and many of their seasons still have incomplete records. So at best, they only have the opportunity to earn about half as much WAR. Couple that with the fact that 2/3 of the Negro League players were inducted in 2006, and that would artificially increase the weight of that 1 year. Mainly, it's just that when people complain about the recent inductees watering down the Hall of Fame, nobody's talking about Negro League players anyway. They are not part of the problem, but since they would look like part of the problem, if included, I'm leaving them out. And this includes Satchel Paige and Monty Irvin. Both had some WAR in the AL and NL, but spent far more time in the Negro Leagues. I don't know where to draw the line, so for the sake of this exercise, they're out too. And there you go. Here is the resulting scatter plot showing career WAR versus year of induction. Before we move on, I want to show something to the skeptics out there in case you don't believe WAR ever describes what you see with the eyeball test. This point down here is Harold Baines. Not the worst Hall of Famer, no, but comfortably in the bottom tier where most of his and the Hall's detractors would put him. Now, the worst Hall of Famer, though he has his defenders these days, is Tommy McCarthy, who I mentioned earlier, from back in 1946. There's Ray Schock in 1955, Lloyd Wainer from 1967, Chick Hafey in 1971, High Pockets Kelly from 1973, Rick Farrell in 1984, and Bill Mazeroski in 2001. Everybody's favorite examples of poor Hall of Famers are all valued exactly where you'd expect them to be. See? WAR works! Oh, and these recent points, bottom right, that seem to be forming a lower tier line, Raleigh Fingers, Bruce Sutter, Trevor Hoffman, Lee Smith, and Billy Wagner. Not surprising if you understand WAR's mechanics that most relief pitchers also come in low, but in the interest of fairness, I'm leaving them in mathematically inconvenient as it may be. Now let's throw a linear trend line on the graph, and oh my God, it's sloping down. Clearly we're watering down the Hall of Fame. Okay, hang on a second. First of all, let's quantify this observable decline. Minus 0.147, so basically minus 0.15 WAR per year. Yeah, that's substantial. Over the course of the 90 years of voting, that's basically Tommy McCarthy's entire career value. So yes, the Hall of Fame has been watered down. It is not, however, a question of if, but rather a question of when and over what time period. There is something you need to understand about a linear trend line. The most important points are the ones at the end and the ones at the beginning. Where you start is critically important, and the Hall of Fame class of 1936 was Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, Walter Johnson, Honus Wagner, and Christy Mathewson. And the Hall of Fame class of 1937 was Tris Speaker, Napoleon Lajoie, and Cy frickin' Young. And then in 1938, Grover Cleveland, Old Pete Alexander. Guys, those original 9 inductees are not merely great. They transcend even legendary status, achieving something more akin to mythology. Babe Ruth, Ty Cobb, and Cy Young aren't just legends, but mythical figures in the baseball pantheon. So yes, absolutely, the Hall of Fame was watered down from this auspicious starting point, and thank God it was. Because if you want to hold these 3 initial classes as the standard for the Hall of Fame, expressed on this graph as 100 WAR or higher, there would only be about 25 guys in the Hall. That's 1 inductee roughly every 3.5 years. And no Hall of Fame runs that way. Not baseball, football, basketball, hockey, or even the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame goes several years without new inductees. There should be new guys every year. So yes, Babe Ruth and Ty Cobb are not the standard that Hall of Famers are held to. Plus, one should also understand that these guys dominated their league in a way that is no longer mathematically possible for a multitude of reasons, which is why their WAR is so high. They stood out from their peers in ways that have been long since rendered impossible. But there is something I want to show you. If I ignore these first 3 classes of truly mythical figures and look at the period from 1939 to 2026, now what do we see? The trend line is flat. To be precise, it's marginally positive at a rate of 0.0085 WAR per year, but since that would now take over 2,000 years to gain Tommy McCarthy's career value, we'll just call it flat. But guys, 1939. The value of the average Hall of Famer has been consistent since 1939. This isn't recent. That's longer than I've been alive. Longer than my father has been alive. That was before my grandparents even met. And the trend since then is level. This is exactly what not watering down the Hall of Fame looks like. In fact, I could go a year further back even and include Pete Alexander, and the slope only changes to 0.0035. Negative, but again, it would now take over 5,000 years to lose the value of Tommy McCarthy's career. So yeah, I'm still calling it flat. But fair enough, we'll use 1939 since that's as far back as we can go and avoid any negative trend. The watering down happened in 1939 with the first Veterans Committee, and it was necessary. And the standard has been held consistent ever since. Period. Now, one might say that we shouldn't repeat the mistakes of the past. That's fine. But if I have a vat of 5% carbolic acid and I add a bucket of 5% carbolic acid, I am not, by definition, watering down the vat. I simply have more of the same concentration. There is another test that we could do here, because basically there is a period where they were absolutely watering down the Hall of Fame. Perhaps you've heard of one, Frankie Frisch. In the All-Time Cardinals video, I described him as being responsible for getting more marginal guys in the Hall of Fame than anyone else, and this is what I'm talking about. From 1967 to 1973, and this is very widely understood, it's been written about extensively, Frankie Frisch, with the help from his former teammate Bill Terry, ran one of the most famously corrupt and cronyistic Veterans Committees in baseball history. If you have any doubt as to WAR's ability to detect a decline, take a look at this. This is the graph from 1939, again ignoring the lofty heights from which it all started, to 1977 when the trend line reached its nadir as a result of the Frisch and Terry years on the Veterans Committee. This is the result of your High Pockets Kellys and your Fred Lindstroms and your Ross Youngs and your Chick Hafeys and your Jesse Hayneses, the Friends of Frankie Frisch category of Hall of Famer. And what is the slope of this decline? Negative 0.32 WAR per year, even ignoring those first three classes. More than double the rate of decline to this day if we include them. So if you have any doubts that we can detect a real known decline using WAR, let them be dispelled now, because this is what watering down the Hall of Fame looks like. This was a known issue, and it is visible. WAR shows it very clearly. And what's happened in the last 50 years? Over my entire lifetime? That line has been pulled all the way back up to flat. And this has been the case for several years now, at least since 2022 when I first started studying this. Far from watering down the Hall, recent selections overall have repaired the damage done by Frisch and Terry and company. They have restored the Hall of Fame to its historical standards after a 40-year period of decline. And they managed to accomplish this without compromising their principles on PED users. I know. Piazza, Rodriguez, Bagwell, and Ortiz. I know. But the preponderance of evidence with those four is not the same as it is with Bonds, or Sosa, or McGuire, or Palmeiro. There are 8 players, in fact, that I believe would have easily been first ballot Hall of Famers were it not that their records were tainted in some way by PEDs. The aforementioned Bonds, Sosa, McGuire, and Palmeiro, Roger Clemens, Manny Ramirez, Alex Rodriguez, and Gary Sheffield. These are all the guys with either 3,000 hits, 500 home runs, 300 wins, or 3,000 strikeouts. And regardless of how you feel about those 8, you cannot deny how much easier it would have been to bring the Hall of Fame standard back to its historic norm could they have benefited from these additional 8 inductees. In fact, if we assume that they would have been elected in their first year of eligibility and add them to the graph accordingly, boom! The trend line since 1939 is actually slightly positive now at 0.05. Now, I'm not saying these guys should be in just so the Hall of Fame can have a better average WAR. That's a terrible argument. I'm merely showing you this to drive home just how much has been accomplished even in their absence. And many say the Hall of Fame is a joke without them, but that's an entirely different video. In any case, no, they are absolutely not watering down the Hall of Fame with recent classes of inductees. That isn't to say that every single guy is definitely worthy, but overall they're doing a fine job. They have repaired the damage done 50 years ago, not recently, 50 years ago by Frisch and Terry, and any claims to the contrary should now be considered mathematically debunked. So, what's really going on here? Why do so many people seem to think this when it's clearly not true? Well, first of all, one should not underestimate the level of disappointment and betrayal that many fans felt once the so-called steroid era came crashing down. We had been cheering for home run records only to find disillusionment at the end of it all. And that stigma, right or wrong, it doesn't go away, and it taints everything we think about everyone from this era. Another issue is the way the game has changed so much in a short amount of time, over the past decade. Everything from rule changes like the pitch clock or the ghost runner to banning the shift to expanding the playoffs to now talk of significant realignment. For the old fans like me, this feels like an abandonment of the game's traditions, which are among its most lasting and endearing aspects. Not something to be taken lightly in the name of pursuing profit. In addition, you have the way the gameplay itself has changed. Pitchers going 6 innings on a good day, sub-200 hitters not losing their jobs the next season, guys with 200 or more strikeouts not being laughable. Again, objective measures that reflect a growing discomfort with what the game looks like, in addition to merely how it's played. And while no one from this era will even be eligible for the Hall of Fame for another decade at least, our distaste for the modernity within the game colors how we view modern Hall of Fame selections as well, fairly or unfairly. And finally, and really, all of this is an offshoot of nostalgia bias. I'm 52 years old. I've been following the sport religiously for 40 years. There is very little I haven't seen, and almost nothing surprises me anymore. But do you remember the first time you saw a walk-off home run? Or your team win in extra innings? Do you remember when first time you saw your team win the World Series? I do, because I was 41 years old. I'm a Red Sox fan. After the disaster of how 2003 ended for them, and then being down 0-3 against the Yankees, when they finally won in 04, my wife at the time and I, now ex-wife, whatever, we opened a bottle of champagne. We jumped up and down like we were there in the locker room with them. Now 2007, that was a little different. Still cool, but different. And honestly, I barely even remember the 2013 World Series. See, each time you see something amazing, it will never recreate that feeling that you had the first time you witnessed it. That's life. That's adulthood. That's growing up. And I want to be clear, I don't say any of this as a rebuke. There is nothing wrong with having any of these biases and influences that I've laid out here. All of these are normal, universal even. It is only when we can't acknowledge them and start to think that our age-old gripes are some kind of enlightened discovery that nobody ever saw before a million times that we start looking like old men yelling at clouds. Will it ever be the same? No, it won't. I'm sorry, it won't. But you may recall in my Pete Rose video how I talked about the joy I feel walking into the Hall of Fame Museum in Cooperstown. How it brings me right back to being a kid again and feeling in some small way that sense of childhood amazement that made me fall in love with the game in the first place. So yeah, I do take it personally when someone wants to come in and take a shit on it. Especially someone who's never been there. But as I said in the video, if you can walk in there and not feel even a small part of that youthful exuberance and nostalgia pulling at you, you might as well already be dead. Find a hole and lay down in it already. Or you can stop complaining about every damn thing and go and let yourself experience some actual joy in what remains of your miserable life. Baseball is good. The Hall of Fame is fine. And until next time, I do hope to see you at the ballpark.